So welcome to the show, Rujul.
Hey, Sarah, thanks so much for having me. I couldn't be more excited to be on the show.
And I am really excited to have you here. I mean, your personal journey is fascinating. And what you're doing now with Zip is really, really great. And we've got a lot of listeners in the procurement space, obviously in the supply chain space. And I know they're all going to be really excited to hear about Zip and the potential it has to really transform their current procurement processes. So why don't we dive in? Before we talk about Zip, though, I want to just touch on your journey a little bit because, as I said in your bio, you dropped out of Harvard to found Flightcar, and that is one bold move. And I love talking about entrepreneurship and the huge variety of pathways to success that are really out there in business and in careers. And so I don't think it gets more impressive than your story. So tell us a little bit about your journey, what that's looked like up until getting into Zip.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say that, but I can certainly share more about the journey. But yeah, so Zip is company number two for me. Before this, I was the co-founder and CEO of a totally unrelated and totally different company called Flightcar. So you're right. We would give you free airport parking by renting out your car to someone else, fully insured. And growing up, I grew up in New Jersey, and so we would fly out of Newark all the time. And when you go to Newark, you see huge parking lots on the left of people paying 18, $20 a day to have their cars sit there, and then on the right there's thousands and thousands of Hertz and Avis and Dollar and Thrifty and whatever cars. And it was just one day it sort of just occurred to us that felt a little weird. And then of course now you have obviously Airbnb and sort of sharing is just such a sort of normal thing. And so that was the inspiration to start the company back in late 12, early 13. And my co-founders and I, we all dropped out of school and ended up running the company for about 4 years. And we grew to about 17 different airport locations and about 200 people. And then ended up doing a sale to Mercedes-Benz thereafter. And then after that worked at Airbnb for a couple of years, which is where I really started to feel this pain point around sort of the intake to procure part of the procurement life cycle, and then started Zip last year, which I can jump more into that too if it makes sense.
Yeah, well, we're gonna talk about Zip, and we're gonna do a deep dive into what exactly you guys are doing. And I appreciate you for sharing your journey because it's not your typical journey. I don't think entrepreneur is ever a typical journey because there's so many different things that happen. So I can definitely relate to that. So of course, you're now co-founder and CEO of Zip. So give us an overview. Well, you did say how Zip kind of started, but tell us a little bit about the brand story and tell us about what you do and how you help your customers.
Yeah. So I'll start with sort of how this all began. My co-founder Lou and I used to work at Airbnb. I worked in product, he worked in engineering, and in our jobs we were responsible for we needed to make a number of purchases, and there were some larger contracts at Airbnb that we were responsible for, and it was just in our experience it was just so sort of confusing as a business user to sort of figure out, okay, I need to hire a contractor. I need to buy $50,000 of software that I need approval for. Where's the one place I go? Where's the one place I go to like initiate this? And
Right.
then how does it get tracked across the budget owner, who's often decentralized today? Of course, legal, procurement, and sourcing, and IT, and data security, and risk, and all these cross-functional teams and partners before something gets into sort of almost the rubber stamp process of the PR to PO. Everything before that is largely just done so manually. In fact, the procurement person I used to work with, he used to joke with me. He was like, "Oh, my job is like that of an air traffic cop. Like all I'm doing is trying to land all these different planes at the right times, but like that's not what I was hired for. That's not even fun, but it's also not high leverage for me, right? I'm just like bugging people at this point to follow up, and so that was the inspiration for us to start Zip, focused on sort of the intake to procure before the procure to pay part of the life cycle. And so Zip provides one place for any employee at the organization. No training required, super simple for them to initiate a request. Everything is no code config on the back end. So you don't need IT. Procurement can just self administrate this, change the
Nice.
right conditional questions, right? So forth, capture the info that then turns into a crystal clear sort of approval workflow of here's what's sequential, here's what's parallel across all the different cross-functional teams, and then connect into the P2P or ERP on the back end to hand off into a clean PR or draft PO. So we like to almost joke it's sort of like if you order Domino's, right? There's so much clarity on where things are in
Awesome.
the process.
So when you say PR, what do you mean? Explain saying to me.
Oh, sorry. I mean like a formal purchase requisition in
There
a
we go.
Oracle Fusion or a Coupa or a Workday or NetSuite, right? One of the sort of core backend sort of systems. So at the end of the flow, we'll depending on the system, create the PR in that system, and then it'll run through the processes of approving the purchase requisition in that system.
Awesome. Awesome. No, I just wanted to ask, just in case somebody in the audience didn't know what you meant by PR.
No.
We all know PO, right? Purchase order. But I just wanted to make sure we got PR right as well. So, what was he using before? Was he using just like an Excel spreadsheet to try to land all these planes? Like what was in his toolbox?
Yeah, no, and that's something we commonly see now. It was true then, and true with a number of customers today and prospects. Yeah, it's most commonly some sort of custom sort of match between Google Sheets, of course, lots and lots of email, maybe Slack or Teams messages, and maybe some custom implementations and ticketing in Jira or ServiceNow. But inevitably, it's not working because those
Right.
systems don't talk to the backend systems often. They're not built to solve this problem. There isn't visibility, and so what I just often find is someone in procurement is just fielding tons of questions every day for people asking, wait, but what's happening with X or Y? And the problem often, unfortunately, is that if you can't see what's behind, who's responsible for something, then you just blame the person in front of you.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's often procurement or sourcing because there is no visibility into what's actually happening. And it could just be gated because, the legal team is working on red lines and they're waiting with the vendor, but no one knows and the requester doesn't know.
Right. And it stifles collaboration, right? We want to get away from these silos that we've been working in, and that really stifles collaboration. And that's one of the things that I like about what you're doing at Zip is that, I always say collaboration is the future of business, and I think you guys are taking that head on to really make it easier for everybody to work together. Now, before we dive in a little bit deeper, you started in the middle of COVID. You know, Tell us about that journey. Why did you decide to launch during COVID, and how has that been for you?
Yeah, it was. Well, we certainly didn't know we would be starting the company during COVID. We had
Right.
both given our respective notices about 6 months prior, and my last day was late March of last year, and my co-founder Luz was like a week later, and of course that was like peak shutdown, if I remember. That was like right when things were starting to. I think we all sort of felt like, oh wow, this is something real. Like this is going to sort of change our lives, and so it was right in the middle of that. But we of course had the conviction. We knew what we were going to do, and
Yeah.
so it was just a matter of doing it. But it was such a different dynamic. I actually didn't meet my co-founder for in person since we started the company in almost a year and a half
Wow.
until last week. We were just on Zoom calls all day, and obviously most of the folks we have on the team now, we've actually never met in person. We will have an office, but we don't today, so it's all remote. So
Amazing.
it's been fascinating, and it's also been amazing to sort of meet so many procurement and thought leaders because. And I think folks have been, when you're holed up at home, folks are just somewhat more willing to talk to you because, like, they're not in the office. They're just, doing marathons between Zoom meetings and a little bit of a break
Yes.
to, talk through things at a higher level is often refreshing. So that's worked out well too.
Amazing, amazing. I can't believe you only met last week. I mean, what a crazy time it's been. But let's dive a little bit more into your product. So you have your key product, which is at the end of the purchase. So let's start by looking at the Zip intake side. How does it work and what are the benefits? Because as you say, the average employee doesn't know much potentially about finance, legal, IT. So this really does the work for them, right? They don't really have to know a lot about those different aspects of the business.
Yep. No, no, exactly. So intake is a very, very important part of any sort of request or any purchase or spend, right? Because that's actually how the request comes in initially, and how procurement and sourcing can actually manage that request from that point to to completion, hopefully at the end. And one of the things that I constantly sort of and our team sort of constantly sees is intake forms sort of go one of two ways or intake sort of paradigms go one of two ways. Typically, one, it's a super long intake because unfortunately, a lot of the systems out there are just not that flexible. And if I'm trying to buy software versus services versus just buy some gifts for some of our customers, very very different questions are applicable. Just given the nature of the spend. But unfortunately, what happens is that there's really like one long form or two or three very long forms for procurement to collect all the information. And then what happens is that the requester in the business looks at it and says, "Oh, I don't think I'm ready for that yet." And then of
Right.
course they're going to go try to find a vendor. They'll negotiate. They'll get the contract, and then at the end they'll come in and provide that, right? And now the issue is it's hard to drive leverage when you're looped in so late, unfortunately. And so that's one problem. The other issue we often see is it's like just send an email to procurement at xyz.com. But then everything is manual because everyone is asking the same questions in different ways, and you have to send them some sort of form. And now you can't, if you don't collect that information in the right way, you cannot automate anything downstream because everything upstream is manual itself.
Right.
And that causes a ton of sort of downstream pain. So it's sort of like pick your poison these days, right? Like upstream pain or downstream pain. And that's not good. And so what Zip does, and what we're sort of fundamentally built on, is the idea that it should be like kicking something off should be super lightweight for the end user and require absolutely no training, but be extremely flexible. And so Zip is no code configuration. And so for procurement can actually ask the right questions based on the nature of spend, the cost center of the department, the spend magnitude, any number of variables, right? So for example, if someone is trying to buy, new software, add a new software vendor, might want to ask the question, hey, what types of data are you sharing with the software vendor? Or do you, have no clue yet? And that's fine too, and we'll handle
Right.
it accordingly.
Yeah.
Versus, if someone's trying to bring on board a contractor, great, what systems is this person going to need access to? And what that might do is in the downstream workflow, after everything is approved and there's a formal purchase order, there might need to be like a Jira ticket or a ServiceNow ticket or something for IT to tell them, hey, this contract is fully approved. We should give them access to these systems that they're already approved for, because usually we see
Right.
just a lot of companies will drop that ball because it's a manual step at the end. And so
Yeah.
the intake will then drive the downstream workflow, but it's super, super flexible and conditional based on what the user is looking for.
Amazing, amazing. Because a lot of times, you hear that, people want to work with systems like yours. And then they're like, well, we need to get IT involved and we need to do this and we need to do that. And so there's a big undertaking. There's a lot of people involved. It takes time. But what you're saying is that yours is kind of plug and play. And then once the system is ready to go and they're looking to bring on some new vendors and potentially need to put those into the system, they can create tickets and easy things like that for the other departments to just get that ticket and action that item.
Yep. No, that's exactly correct. This isn't like implementing some sort of old school super IT heavy system. Our
Yeah.
median deployment time today is about 6 weeks. So
Wow.
that's pretty fast, and with a lot of the systems that we are close to, and it takes on average less than 4 hours of IT time, just because the IT effort is really there to give us access to certain
Right.
systems. And then the implementation, we actually work with our champion and usually the head of procurement or head of sourcing at the organization to actually build out the flows correctly. And it's okay. Like sometimes we'll have folks that'll come in and say, here's my 6 lucid charts of like my flows. And like I want to do it this way, and that's awesome. They actually realize, oh wait, I actually don't even need some of these steps. I can actually automate some of this even more so, and we'll work with them. But candidly, more commonly, folks will come in and they won't have all of that written down and super clean much more often than not, and that's okay because we've built best practice templates now. So for software, services, etc., everything from the question to the downstream workflows and the conditions and the routing. So we just need to understand sort of how the company's structured, and we can get them up and running fast. We're actually, funnily enough, we're in the middle of a deployment with a customer that's almost 1,000 people. We signed them on May 30th, so 19 days ago.
Awesome.
They're going live on Monday.
Wow.
So that's going to be a pretty fast deployment, but that certainly would not be possible, in a more traditional system.
Yeah, and I think, it's about sitting. So I think what takes the most time really is to sit down and get those processes out of either people's heads or, from Excel and different things like the different tools that they're using to really put that into your system and make it usable for that user in a way that they don't have to reinvent and they don't have to learn too much, right? Because you're just taking what they do currently and you're moving it online to make it more efficient.
No, absolutely. And I think the reason this is such a challenge typically is the average, requester that's putting in a request. The problem is, 80% or 70% of the requests are coming from 90% of the across the remaining 90% of the organization that doesn't buy things infrequently, but you don't know which of those users is going to put a request in. And for them,
Right.
this is such an infrequent occurrence that by the time they do it once and they figured it all out, the next time they need to do it, they've sort of half forgotten how it works.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's not intuitive to people, and people often don't even appreciate that. Wait a minute, there's like 5 or 6 teams that need to approve this thing. They don't know, and so it's just one of our core sort of values and principles is this has to be almost a consumer grade product, especially for users in the business, because if you make the right path the easiest path or the happy path, then more people will just adhere to the process and follow. And procurement and sourcing will get looped in earlier. But unfortunately, today it's often the hardest path.
Yeah.
The easiest path is to not do that.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times with new systems that people are using, they don't actually take advantage of all the benefits. Sometimes when it's too complicated, right? If it's too complicated, they'll do 1 or 2 things within the system, but they won't necessarily get all of the benefits from that particular platform that they've decided to use. So how does Zip change that?
Yeah, no. So we have a couple of different personas, right? So you've got the requester in the business, you've got the procurement and sourcing persona who's actually using our product on a day-to-day basis to actually manage requests across the organization and where things stand and so forth. And then you've got folks in the middle who are approving things potentially from different teams or based on budget or whatever other criteria. And so our the idea is that for the requester should be very intuitive. Almost it should look like it's very simple for them to collaborate, to kick off the request, and then that's it. And then just get updates on what's happening with their request over Slack or email or Microsoft Teams continuously, and then they're sort of done. Even for an approver, it's almost about they should spend as little time as they need to in the product because they should
Right.
get their job done, they should move on, and it should be straightforward. But for procurement, there should be really crystal clear sort of visibility across the organization. And I think to your point, like if you have all requests that are material flowing through the system, then for the first time we now have data on things like cycle times and where bottlenecks are, and you can actually use that to help other teams and even the procurement function actually justify things like headcount and other things, because often like we see this with a lot of customers, they're shocked at how many requests are going through the system because they didn't realize that these things are actually happening, but they weren't even hitting their radar.
Right.
we're hitting their radar very late. And so this just helps with a lot of the visibility and pain points there.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. That was a great segue because Zip combines a couple of my favorite and the most talked about topics in supply chain right now, which is visibility and collaboration. So, what are your thoughts on why these are such key trends? I mean, particularly at this pivot point in time post COVID, where we're moving towards new ways of working and thinking. I think companies are still looking at people working remotely or maybe hybrid options.
No, so I really feel that like the world has changed a lot in the last 5, 7, 10 years, right? There's a lot more, primarily in indirect spend. There's a lot more decentralized sort of initiation of buying, right? Because there's people in marketing and folks in engineering and all the different teams initiating more purchases. And there's more stakeholders now than there were ever before. Because, traditionally, you didn't need data security. It
Right.
wasn't like a common thing, right? If you're buying materials, like that doesn't make much sense. And now you have data security, you have IT, you have risk, you have even the budget approvals are much more decentralized today than they were in the past. And because of just the increase in software and services spend, the majority of spend that comes through Zip, by the way, is software and services, a
Hmm.
significant majority across all of our customers. And what's happening now is that people are adding way more vendors than they used to in the past because
Right.
for the direct side, you're not going to add that many vendors, but for indirect and with all these new software vendors and services vendors and more people across the organization buying, there's a lot more vendors being added that need to go through vetting, and there's a lot more teams that need to vet the vendors from security and IT and the budget owner and legal and so forth. And those two forces just compound how important it is to actually nail collaboration because there's just so many more stakeholders than there were before. And unfortunately, I don't think it's one of those things that gets sort of linearly more complicated. It's unfortunately like exponentially more complicated as you add more
Right.
stakeholders into the sort of collaboration, right? And so it's just so important to have a great integration into Slack and email and Teams and meet people where they are and allow them to
Yes.
chat with each other or share attachments and do a lot of this back and forth that otherwise would just be handled offline. And the other, by the way, I think the other reason that that's important is, there's more and more purchases that get renewed today because a lot of the purchases are software. And if it's done over email on a one-off basis, or if it's in like verbally communicated, then you've now lost that context because when this thing renews, a year from now or 2 years or whatever from now, and maybe there's someone else that requester's gone, they're not at the company. No one really knows why we bought this as a company and like what the context was and that's one of the benefits that we provide too because we store all of that for you. So when it comes time to renew, that data is there, context is there. Otherwise, people are just relearning the same information over and over again, and it's just so much.
Yes. Yes, and just making it easier. I think that's all people want, right? It's just for their lives to be easier and not more complicated. And when you've got too many things, it just gets way too complicated. So let's talk about your ideal client. So if I'm sitting in the audience and I'm listening to us or I'm watching us right now, who should pick up the phone and call you?
Yeah, so we're largely focused. So companies that have a lot of indirect spend and or just an increasing number, which candidly today, from our conversations, is almost the significant majority of companies are experiencing more and more software and services spend than they've really ever had before. So if you're in a position where you see more sort of growth on indirect and software and services spend, and the company on sort of the lowest end is maybe a couple of hundred employees, up to we have customers and late stage prospects that are very very large companies in the tens of thousands or over 100,000 employees. But I would say the sweet spot is in the couple of thousand employee range. From a couple high hundreds to a couple of thousand employees today. That's where I would say the majority of our customers are in that segment today. But the truth is this problem unfortunately exists, after the company gets past a couple hundred employees. I mean, it's sort of never going away otherwise because it's always there, and there's always more and more stakeholders in the mix, and more and
Sure.
more requesters across the organization that might need something, and it
Mhm.
just gets more and more complicated.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you were able to let us know what that ideal customer for you is. And it sounds like it can really be anybody, right? Because they are all having this pain point of, really complicated procurement and having to, like you said, land a lot of airplanes. I really like that analogy. And so my next question to you, and this is one of my favorites, is around the case study. Why don't you paint us a picture? So if I'm in the audience and I'm like, okay, I'm in your ideal client spot and I really like what you're saying today, paint us a picture of what it has looked like as a customer of yours, right? So what was the challenge that they came to you with? What was the solution you provided? And what was the ROI that they saw?
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a customer that's top of mind that I was recently catching up with. So this company is about 1,300 or so employees. They're a technology company, and we worked with the head of procurement there. And before implementing Zip, she had tried to manage her process largely with email and Google Sheets, and simply because there were no other sort of alternatives to sort of track where each request is, with sort of cells and then the sheet. And she actually had a pretty sophisticated workflow that she'd built out over, on Lucid Chart across, for software versus goods and services and different types of flows. And when she actually looked into it, she realized that like the average request was requiring a little bit more than 30 emails going back and forth because
Wow.
there's so many different stakeholders, right? Legal has to sign off, the different budget owners, and I mean the same problems that we've been chatting about, and she just lacked an understanding of what was really going on across the company. Like, what do we have in flight? Is something blocked? Where is it blocked? And it would often turn into requesters complaining because they didn't know. They would kick the request out. They'd fill out. It was a form that they would fill out, and then it would sort of go into a black hole because they wouldn't know what was going on. And of course, then that person then ends up blaming procurement, right? Because they don't know that, wait a minute, there's actually like 7 other steps that are happening here behind the scenes, but like
Right.
it's actually sitting and it's gated here. And so that was 30 plus emails per request, and just so much sort of manual back and forth was sort of the pain point that this company had. And we went live with them from start to go live was actually only 24 days. So it was one of our pretty relatively quick sort of rollouts, 3.5 weeks or so. This company had just top of mind because I was talking to them recently. So they've been live for about 6 months, almost 6 months on our platform. And things are very, very different now. So they've actually reduced their cycle times by 43%. So
Wow.
meaningfully, and simply because in Zip, you can parallelize, they have part in some of their flows, they have 4 or 5 steps that are happening at the same time. 5 steps in the parallel flow versus just, it used to just be one after the other because it was such a hard coordination problem otherwise,
Right.
and no one
Yeah.
could tell if things are getting done in the right sequence. And so, so that has helped a lot. And their request volume is much like they've actually captured and improved compliance because more of the things that were sort of getting lost are actually now being brought to light. But on a consistent basis, this company handles a little bit more than 200 requests per month in Zip, and they manage north of about $200 million to spend annually on Zip, and it's worked really well from them from sort of improving cycle times, and they're actually in the midst of running an NPS survey across their requester base, but they're already starting to see really positive results there, and I think the biggest sort of measure or biggest sort of benefit for their requester was our Slack integration, because they get
Oh,
procurement has reviewed, now it sits with FP&A. I get a Slack message as a requester, right? So I know what's happening
nice.
to my request.
Yeah, they must be really, really happy. What is NPS?
Oh, sorry, Net Promoter Score. It's just a measure of how happy someone actually is with a product.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I can't wait to hear those results, or I'm sure you can't wait to hear those results because it sounds like the transition that Zip has really been able to make for that particular company is just going to elevate how happy everybody is now with the process. right? And I mean, the amount of emails that that must have cut down, right? Because with people not really knowing where their request is, and now they can know where their request is. I mean, she's probably just so happy about the amount of emails she's getting on a daily basis because they've probably reduced by, I would say, what, like 60%
Yeah, yeah, or more,
or
simply
more? Yeah.
because it's all just correctly routed through the system in a more automated way.
And
Absolutely.
And who doesn't like a cleaner inbox? I mean, I do. I am one that likes a very, very clean inbox. So I can only imagine how she's feeling right now. Awesome. I'm so glad that you shared that story with us. So I want to know, what does the future hold for Zip? And what about yourself as an entrepreneur? Tell us what we have to look forward to.
No, absolutely. So we're really focused on sort of building the world's best intake to procure solution, and hopefully I think we're there today, but we still need to sort of keep getting better and better because there's always room for improvement, and I think the thing that's just that my co-founder Lou and I are just so passionate about, right, is so I used to, when I worked at Airbnb, I worked on Airbnb search. So if you go to Airbnb.com, what the search experience is like, how fast the page loads, right? What the UI looks like. If you type in LOS, do you mean Los Angeles? Do you mean something else? Like I'm in the Bay,
Yeah.
it could be Los Altos, right? And so forth. And any little detail you tweak, like you make it perfect, and you make a little tweak, and you can see, oh, that actually lifts global revenue by $100 million or something, which is because it lifted conversion by 0.1% because someone somewhere would have X'd out of the window, but they still clicked the button because you optimized. All right. It's like that level of precision. Meanwhile, as a business user, I go to I won't name, but some old school P2P or ERP system. And like, I work in tech and I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do. Or how to like even go to the next
Right.
screen. Right. And it's sort of like, well, if I can't, I mean, so many more people are not going to be able to figure this thing out. And it's almost like the software sort of treats you as, well, you're an employee, so screw you. You kind of have to figure this thing out, right? But as a consumer, I can take my business elsewhere, and unfortunately, that sort of seeps through when you actually look at the user experience.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's right, and I don't think that it actually, unfortunately, helps the people on the other end of that because they're not bad people. Like they're just trying to do their thing too. And there's a way that we can take the consumer approach and really, really apply it to this complex problem around intake to procure. And so that's what we're most passionate about. And there's a lot more coming around collaboration and just improving the experience for us here over the next 6 to 12 months, and then downstream after that. So that's what's really next for us, and that's I think what we're the most passionate about.
I cannot wait. I was just actually on Airbnb the other night and going through the search function because I was searching a whole bunch of stuff. And so if you can make the procurement experience like that, I mean, you're just going to change the game, I think, forever. Because what we do in our personal lives and how we search on websites and within platforms in our personal life, I mean, we don't just leave that at the door when we go to work. We want to have those same types of experiences in our day to day that make it fun, that make it something that we want to go to work and actually do. It shouldn't be hard. We should be able to work in a way that is fun and easy and gets the job done and innovates, right? It helps us innovate for the company as well. And I think that's what we can expect from you. And I'm super excited about that. And so, your journey is a tale of true entrepreneurship, and what you're doing right now with Zip is so exciting. I mean, procurement is probably something we don't talk about often enough on the show because it's just such a huge piece of the supply chain puzzle. It affects cost, risk, speed, effectiveness, and it's just so exciting to see innovations like Zip that are really making a difference. So, thank you so much, Rajul, for joining us today on the show, sharing with us your journey of entrepreneurship, and then diving deep into what you're doing at Zip and how you are revolutionizing supply chain and procurement.
No, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me, and I'm glad you're excited as well. That makes two of us.